And today we have an exciting event, Open Source Essential Consuming and Contributing by Jenn Skeivik. Jenn is the Senior Manager of the Open Source Program Office at Boeing. She has been working in open source for over 10 years and has a wealth of experience in software engineering leadership roles across aerospace, defense, and biotech industries. She has earned Bachelor of Science degrees in Computer Science and Zoology, and holds a master's degree in Computational Biosciences from Arizona State University. In her spare time, she volunteers for the DNA Doe Project and hangs out with her husband, 5 kids, and her cat. And today, she is going to delight us with an amazing talk about open source essentials, how to consume and contribute. And I will lend the floor to her today. Thank you so much, Jenn. We're super excited on learning from you today.
Thank you, Luz, and thank you so much for the introduction. I'm super excited, everyone joining from around the world. This is really great, so thanks for taking the time to join today. I do have 2 Boeing teammates on the call with me that are also panelists, Yen Ho and Nissa, and they'll be in the chat if you have questions. I also have some other team members from our open source program office team also in the chat that may be responding to messages as well. So just to let you know who all's in there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops, can you see my screen? Okay.
We can see it.
Okay, great. All right, go ahead and get started here. Like was mentioned in my bio, I have a degree in zoology, and you might be wondering why, why that is. I always loved computers since a young age. I started coding on a VIC-20 when I was little. Always loved it, but nobody told me the pay differential between going into software engineering and zoology when I started out in college. So I went into zoology first. I was very broke when I graduated. It was really hard to find a job. I didn't really like that. And so I went back to software engineering and got a CS degree in that, and have been doing that ever since. Also had a company for a while, which I highly recommend if you're ever thinking of doing a startup and going out on your own. It's a great experience. I did that for a number of years and learned a ton. And like was mentioned in my intro, I'm currently the senior manager of the OSPO at Boeing. Formerly, I was in OSPOs at IBM and General Motors. I love open source. Every day I get to talk with people about different technologies, cool new open source projects they're doing, and get to just get a really broad exposure to a lot of different tech and exciting projects. And so that's what I really love about working in open source. Also, the DNA Doe Project, I do that in my spare time. And that's, if you're not familiar with it, it's a nonprofit organization that specializes in identifying unidentified human remains with open data. So it's a really exciting group, and check it out if you'd like to learn more about that. And really the purpose of my talk today, I've got 2 pictures alongside here. The top picture is from, I think about, I don't know, 10 years ago. And you can see how chaotic my family life was. I think I was a software engineer when this picture was taken, and there was a lot I didn't know about open source. And I wished I knew back then. And then in this current picture, that's just from a couple years ago of my family. And this is after I had moved into open source and just really loved it. And so everything was kind of calm now. And I just want to share what I wish I knew when I was in the top picture with you all today, so you don't make the same mistakes I did with open source when starting out. So here's our agenda for today. I'll go over what is and what is not open source. This is actually not as clean cut as you would think it is, why that matters. And then I'll break the rest of the talk into 2 different sections. Consuming open source, what you need to know there. After that section, we'll have a Q&A break, so you can use the chat to drop questions there. And then we'll move into contributing to open source, how to get started, and what are the benefits to you from being involved with open source. And then I'll go over one of my favorite resources that you can take advantage of for free. And then we'll have another Q&A after that section. So first off, what is open source? And it really depends on who you ask. This is kind of surprising to me that there isn't like one single definition. So depending on the organization that is involved with open source, they will give you a different answer. So I'm going to share my favorite definition of open source, and that is open source that is available. Open source is software that's available under a license that meets the 10 criteria in the open source definition from the Open Source Initiative. So the Open Source Initiative is a nonprofit group that has defined like these 10 different criteria for if you're calling something open source, it has to meet these 10 things. And I won't go through all of the 10 here, but for example, it's like non-discrimination against person or groups. You can't say, oh, I'm going to make this open source, except if you live in a certain country or you work for a certain company, for example, you can't have that in an open source license. So there's a list of all the licenses approved by the Open Source Initiative at that link there. And there's dozens and dozens of them. And this is kind of a challenge in open source because it makes it difficult to comply with licenses if you have so many of them around and they all have different criteria. And it just makes everything a little more difficult. So this organization is also trying to limit what they call license proliferation and just keep a smaller subset of open source licenses. But you can check out the list there and see all the different kinds. There's really just a few that you'll see routinely, and so I'll go through those later on in the presentation. So what is not open source? And this is where I see a lot of developers mention, they say, oh, it's free, it's open source, or there's source code I found on GitHub, it's open source. It's not, and it can get you into trouble later on if you treat it the same way as open source. So this isn't an exhaustive list of what is not open source, but just some of the common ones that I see people get tripped up on. So freeware is not open source. If you're downloading something and it's free, like a free binary, it probably has end user license agreement or terms and conditions associated with it. And it's not something under an open source license. Unlicensed source code, that's another one I commonly see where people find something on GitHub. And there's a fairly large percentage of of repositories on GitHub that are unlicensed. So they don't have a license file in them. There's no license in the headers in the source code out there. It's just kind of someone put their source code up and left it there, but didn't say what you could do with it. So unlicensed source code is not open source. It's just source code. So you don't know what you can do with that because there's no license attached to it. And just a tip here, and I've had this work in the past, if you find something on GitHub that you want to use that doesn't have a license associated with it, sometimes you can reach out to the developer and just ask them, hey, would you, I'd really like to use your project. Would you consider putting it under an open source license? And I've actually never had anyone say no to that. So if you find unlicensed source code, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it after talking, if you can talk with the developer and get them to add a license for it. Data that accompanies open source projects. This is another common thing that I see that can cause a lot of trouble down the road, especially with AI and machine learning projects where you have training data associated with an open source project. And what happens is you'll have source code under, say, for example, an MIT license, and then a bunch of training data in the same repository, but it's not called out under a separate license. And I've seen all kinds of things. For example, somebody scraped a bunch of email addresses from a public forum and then dumped it in a GitHub repo along with some like Apache licensed open source code. And really, that's not like, you need to be really careful dealing with data and understand what license that is. And if you can use it, it's just really problematic. So when you're dealing with open source, just be aware that if you bump into some data, you may need to do some digging to see if you can use that or what license applies to that data. So why does all this matter? estimates vary, but around 80% of a modern software application is open source. And a typical application has several hundred to several thousand open source packages, especially if you're using containers. You can just get a lot of open source in the application. And every one of those packages has the potential to introduce legal risk through the licenses there, also security risk through vulnerabilities introduced by open source, and also technical risk. If your application is dependent on something that was developed 5 years ago that no one's maintaining anymore, and has vulnerabilities that aren't being patched, and if you need an update to that and it's not being kept up, you can introduce technical risk into your application as well. And really the key thing here and key takeaway from this talk is, as a developer, you can make a really, really big difference early in the software development lifecycle in managing these risks while still accelerating your development speed. So just having awareness of these concepts is really important, and you can make a big difference in mitigating issues that could happen down the road at the point when you bring open source into your application. So consuming open source, know your company's process and policy around open source consumption. Throughout my career in open source, I still bump into developers within companies that are not aware that their company has, first off, has a policy, and then also has a team to help people comply with that policy. So in your company, it may be called, like it is here at Boeing, an open source program office. It can be called an open source steering committee, a governance board, or sometimes your legal department handles that. But there probably is some type of organization if you work for a medium to large company, or even at a small company. Sometimes there's an attorney assigned to help with this, or somebody from product security, InfoSec, or vulnerability management. Sometimes all of the open source is managed in the same organization. Sometimes it's those different groups working together to manage it. But just be aware of what your company's policy is for consuming open source and who is there to help you. Every company is different. And again, like people like me and my team members on the call today, we're here to help you. So find out who your contact is in your company. Also, if you're a freelancer or if you have a startup, this still really, really impacts you. And so it's very sad when this happens, but acquisitions have been canceled due to license violations in open source. So for example, if you have your own proprietary code for your startup and you're distributing it, and you've statically linked GPL to your proprietary code, which means you essentially need to open source your proprietary code under terms of the GPL because you've created a combined work there. No one's going to want to pay for that because you don't really have any proprietary code anymore. And so it is really tragic when this happens, but that has happened more than once. And so you really need to be aware, even if you're freelancing or you have a startup, how you're using open source in your applications. Also, don't phone a friend for advice, get legal advice from a lawyer. So on developer forums, I see all kinds of wrong in terms of, somebody's asking, oh, I found this and it has no license and what can I do with this? Or, oh, I have these 2 different licenses and is this okay? And what should I do? And I've seen a lot of really bad information getting passed around on those forums. So if you're wondering if there's something that you can legally do or you need a review of a particular situation, get an attorney or someone knowledgeable in that space to help you, and don't just ask around on forums. Vulnerabilities can also be extremely expensive. The really famous example of this was from a few years back with Equifax. They reached a $700 million settlement with US regulators, and that was due to a data breach because they didn't patch an open source vulnerability that had been known for a couple months at least at that point. And so that ended very, very badly for them. So the point here is you need to know what's in your application, and you really play a really key role right up front in the development process when you consume open source in your applications. So we'll go over some license basics here. you have to meet all of the license obligations. So if you have an application with thousands of open source licenses, you're going to have to comply with all of them. And I'll go through how to do that in a minute. Like, nobody can remember off the top of their head. I've been doing this a long time and I still can't. All the different obligations and all the different license types and which licenses are compatible with what. And I mean, that's just unrealistic to expect someone to know all that offhand. But I want to make you aware of some concepts here that will help you. First off, just here are some screenshots from GitHub. I'm using Express as an example here in the rest of the talk. If you go into GitHub, they have a nice feature now where just if it has a license assigned, at the top of the repository, you can see MIT, and it's got the permissions there, limitations of the license, and conditions. So whatever licenses apply to it, here's a GPL example for Ansible. Several more conditions apply to this, but anyway, it's kind of a cheat sheet that's there for you just to remind you of the different terms there. So some concepts to be aware of. There's a primary license and a declared license for an application. So usually that's the same thing, but not always. So in this Express example, it's MIT is its declared license. If I go through the code for that, it's MIT and the code too. So it actually is what it says it is. So its primary license matches the declared license. That's not always the case. Sometimes it'll say, you know, this is an Apache or an MIT. And then if you go look at the source code, it might be something different. So just be aware that it's not always as clean cut as it seems. And also, depending on what files are included in an application, you may have other licenses embedded in the source code for that package that are under a different license. And most of the time that's okay. Whoever developed the open source package has kept licenses that are compatible with each other in bringing all of that together. But that's not always the case. So sometimes they've embedded something in there that is not compatible with the primary or the declared license of the open source package. So it can be, you know, you may need to do a little analysis there. And I'll get into that again, how you can use tooling to help you do this so it doesn't have to be a manual process. And also be aware when you install an open source package, you usually almost always get dependencies that come along with it, and they may be under different licenses as well. So you do have to meet all of those license obligations, not just the top level license that you see on GitHub. Some popular permissive licenses, these are very commercial friendly licenses, so you see them a lot. Apache and MIT, very, very common. Also, if you're going to create an open source project of your own and you want really, really broad adoption, Apache and MIT are good choices because it's compatible kind of with the broadest number of open source policies at different companies and individuals, and you'll just get a lot of adoption that way. Popular, less permissive licenses, this category of licenses is also known as reciprocal, viral, or copyleft licenses. So the GPL family of licenses is the most common that you'll see there. And so you have to be really, really careful when you use these that you meet the terms of the license. And so, for example, with GPL, if you statically link that to your own proprietary code, you're creating a combined work and you really need to open source then that entire work under the terms of the GPL. And sometimes that's fine, and you may intend to do that, and that's great, but you don't want to do that unless you're planning to do that. It's not good to inadvertently do something that you're not planning on. So I'll show you some resources at the end of the talk where you can read up on the different license types and be aware, but these are just general license concepts to be aware of as a developer bringing open source into your application. And then here, you probably do use more open source than you think. So I just use this as an example, but back when I was helping teams every day manage their open source and go through their application code prior to a release to make sure all the licenses were okay and everything was fine, I always found that they used about 5 times more open source than they thought they did. So just using Express as an example here, If you go out to NPM, it's got 31 dependencies. If you look at the package itself, it's got 17 development dependencies on top of that. But when you install it, you don't get 48, you get 57. So you get more. And I didn't go through and see like what else came in that was not listed here. But anyway, you tend to get more than you think you're going to get. And that's important because you do want to minimize the risk of using all those licenses, but you still want to go fast and you don't want to have to dig through and figure out, what are all the licenses. And you want to know that early before you introduce something that now is built into your application. And you definitely don't want to find out about it right before you need to release your software that you have a license problem or some critical vulnerability. So you want to shift all that work left. And really, I cannot recommend this enough. Use software composition analysis tools. I don't have them listed here. There's a ton of them. And depending on the language that you're using in your particular use case, one tool might work a lot better than another one. There are open source SCA tools that you can take a look at that will do a pretty good job for you. And what these tools do is they identify the open source in your application along with their licenses, vulnerabilities that are associated with that particular open source. And oftentimes they'll flag old versions. So say you're 5 or 6 versions behind, it'll tell you, hey, you may want to upgrade this. It's kind of out of date. So these tools will dig through all your code and figure out what's actually there within your build. You can usually call these from a command line interface in your CI/CD pipeline. It'll generate a report for you. And it will save you a ton of time. And the earlier on you can run something like this, the better off you'll be. The other cool thing that SCA tools do for you usually is they will generate a software bill of materials. And this is a very popular topic over the last couple of years due to some government mandates that have come out about requiring producers of software to have a software bill of materials. And essentially that's an industry standard way to represent your third-party software in your application and include license vulnerability and version data. So the SCA tools can help you out there as well. One tip I have to share here for that I see a common mistake that is very time consuming. If you do use these SCA tools, what you want to scan is what is actually in your application. A lot of times developers will scan like everything in their development environment, even if they're not including it in their application. So you want to make sure to scope your scan with what your company policy says to scan, or just what's in your application, and not scan everything. You can actually cause a lot of noise and other stuff that you have to look at if you scan all of your test and development dependencies too. So try to just scan your production dependencies, what's actually in your application, and you'll save yourself a ton of time. Also be aware that snippets can be detected. And so SCA tools, depending on the tool, they can tell if you've taken open source from another project and copied and pasted it into your application. I didn't see this actually too commonly. Usually in a company environment, you don't see that very often. But if you're doing, like say you have a startup or you're getting code from somebody else and they've cut and pasted a bunch of stuff in there, an SCA report will tell you like, oh, this is really GPL code that was copied from this other project that is in your application. And that now means your application, if you didn't, keep it at arm's length and you link to it, means your application is now GPL too. So you need to be aware that, snippets and things, you can use SCA tools to find out if something like that's in your code too. And then also they can automate alerting and reporting. So you don't want to look at, like, say you have an application and it's got 2,000 open source packages in it. You don't want to have to look every time like, oh, did I introduce a new package with a new license or a new vulnerability? You just want to know if there's a problem and if something changed and there's a problem. So you can scan deltas with these SCA tools. They're really great. So again, I can't emphasize enough, use tooling to help you out here. because you don't want to be a licensed expert on everything. You definitely don't want to have to look at, 10 levels down in dependencies to see what's in your software. Leverage these tools. They will save you a ton of time, and use them as early in the life cycle as you possibly can. So I'm going to pause there for questions on consuming open source. See, there's a lot.
A lot of questions here. The first question is, Jen, are open source licenses free?
Yes, so part of the open source definition is that you can't, so say for example, something's available under an open source license. I know I'm not going to have to pay to go get the source code and build that. So that's one of the criteria. You can, however, sell things that are licensed as open source and package additional things around it. But essentially, if it's under an open source license, that means you can get the code from somewhere without having to pay for it.
Great. The next question is, are there any open source communities specifically for women and non-binary folks?
There are. That's a really great question. And actually, there are a lot of really great open source communities in both of those spaces. That I will have to get a list together. I don't have that in the presentation, but if actually, so any of these questions like that, if I need to do some follow-up and get information back for you, please connect with me on LinkedIn and just send me a note. I'm the only Jenn Skeivik on LinkedIn, so I'm easy to find. And just drop me a note, and I'll share a list of those organizations.
That's amazing. Jen is asking about if there is a cost to initiate a license for open source software that you develop.
No, so if you decide to develop an open source project, you can decide according to your own preferences how you want to license that. And just GitHub doesn't charge anything. Like say, for example, you want to put your project on GitHub, it won't charge you anything for that. And you can apply whatever open source license you want to your project. And on GitHub now, it's super easy because you can put your project out and you just say, set up my project with a license file, and you can just pick from a drop-down list and it'll set it up for you. And there's no charge for doing that.
Okay.
And I saw a lot of questions in the chat on shift left, and let me I'll explain that term, or how I was using that term. So essentially, I mean that in terms of just trying to handle these issues as early in the software development lifecycle as possible, because the further, so left meaning just at the beginning, the further on these things go, the more expensive they are to fix. So what happens is, if you don't fix these issues at the beginning, like right for you as a developer bringing in the software, what happens is, your code is integrated with everybody else's code. There's tests that are done, and it gets all the way through. And this isn't unusual. I've seen this a lot. It'll get all the way through to get ready to be released. And then in a legal review or in some kind of company review of the code that you've developed, they find that the licenses used in the software and the open source software are not compatible. And then it's not compatible with your company's license, and then it has to be reworked. And now it's very expensive because all of this other stuff has been done and you're just finding out about it right before release. And then it delays your release, and it's a lot of rework, and it's no fun. So by shift left, I just mean early.
Okay, thank you, Jen. There's an interesting question here. I'll read it out loud. And it says, like, as a developer working on personal projects or on personal time, does just asking the GitHub owner enough, is it enough to ask the GitHub owner to save legal costs on small or solo projects?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So yeah, if you're working on your own projects on your own time and you want to incorporate open source, and there's somebody else that has a small project that is unlicensed, yeah, I mean, as long as they put it under the under that license, then you can use it under the terms that they've put it under, and that's fine, even if it's a small project.
And Elizabeth is asking about the code that has no license. Is it true it defaults to be copyrighted?
Yes. Yeah, so copyright is a whole separate topic. So yes, it's still copyrighted, even if it doesn't have an associated license.
Okay. We can
go ahead.
Well, I guess that we can continue and come back to the questions in a couple of minutes.
Okay, that sounds good. We'll start in with the contribution topic. So how to get started with contributions. Much like consuming open source software, if you do work for a company, check out your company's contribution process first. And related to the last, or one of the questions that we just talked about, for on your own time contributions, some companies have a policy around that and some don't, but check to make sure. There was a really, really sad story about 10 years ago in open source. It was right when I first started doing open source policy and compliance and stuff. And there was a developer that actually did a year of jail time because of a misunderstanding with his company around open source contributions, and a jury that didn't understand what he was doing. And it was just really sad. And I think it was, lack of policy or understanding of policy had a lot to do with that. I don't think that would happen these days because open source is much more pervasive, and hopefully that wouldn't happen anywhere. But if you do work for a company, check out both your contribution process, first for on company time and on your own time, because they may have restrictions on that. And so when you contribute to open source, just be aware that you may not need to sign anything. This varies by project, and it's kind of challenging because every project is really different with the contributions, but they will probably maybe, I don't know, like 50% of the time ask you to sign something when you contribute to a different project. And these are two of the common ones: a developer certificate of origin, a DCO, or a contributor license agreement. These ones are less common. DCOs are very common, and essentially that is asking you to sign your commit messages with that DCO, and you can find the text online if you Google it. Everyone uses the same one, but essentially it's saying that I have the right to contribute this. This is my own work that I'm contributing to this open source project. Occasionally, there will be some weird contributor license agreements. Usually these are pretty standard, but every now and again, a random open source project will have a strange CLA that's really asking you to assign your copyright away, or do some things that are not really that standard in open source. And so these agreements, if they're asking you to sign something, it's really important to read what they're asking you to sign and check it. If you work for a company, run it by your open source contacts at your company to see if it's okay. When you're starting out, it's good to do something that interests you. So if you can do on your own time contributions and that's compatible with your company's policy, it's a great way to get started in open source. I included an example here of how open source projects, again, using Express as an example, they've got these good first contribution tags on some of the issues. So you can go into a project and see like, oh, what's an easy issue where they need help and would be a good way to get started. Also, start slow and build trust in the community. A mistake I see a lot is where somebody will come in because they need something from an open source project and they've never talked to that project before. They don't have any relationship there, but they'll contact them or open an issue and demand that that project do like add some huge new feature or do something for them, even though they're not contributing to the project or actively participating. And you have to remember that most open source project maintainers are unpaid. And so they're doing this, in their spare time or just as an extra thing they enjoy doing. And they're not going to respond that well if you join the project and then start making all these demands on their time. So, start slow, look for good first contribution. If you know someone in the project, that's another good way, to just kind of reach out to them and see, hey, where would be a good place where you need new contributors. Also, non-code contributions are very important to these projects. Documentation is often an area of neglect. So projects often need a lot of help with that. Sometimes they do events and they might, need help coordinating a meetup to publicize the project. And then just general project management tasks, especially on a big open source project. They have all kinds of ways you can contribute aside from code. So just spend some time to get to know the community and where they could use some help. Also comply with the code of conduct. So most open source projects have a code of conduct. I highlighted Expresses here. They're mostly standard on the contributor covenant text. So you'll see commonly that one used across open source projects. So make sure you comply with that and read it, and also report issues if you're in the community and someone violates the code of conduct. Usually there's an email address you can report violations to. And then follow community specific guidelines. So every open source project is really, really different. So for example, this one, they've got this contributing file here in their GitHub repo and also a collaborator guide. So you can check out that documentation to see how to engage with the project. Finally, I just wanted to go through all the benefits to contributing to open source. You can get a lot of technical eminence in your career. Usually when you contribute to open source, that's something that follows you and is not attached to your employer. So if you have a GitHub profile and you're contributing actively there, as you change employers, that GitHub profile typically will follow you and just your employer association changes. But it's a really good way to grow your reputation over time in different communities. And also it's a great way to learn new skills, start contributing to projects if you want to learn a new language or new technology. And then also just the engagement in the community and giving back. It feels a lot better to contribute back to open source projects rather than just, use them all the time. Just that engagement can be very, very satisfying. And then also, if you do work for a company, some companies have a corporate rewards program, and they will give you cash for engaging in certain communities that are very important to them. So check out to see if your employer offers that. That can be another really good reason to get started. All right, so before we go into the last Q&A here, I did want to point you to some extra resources here. So the Linux Foundation has some open source training that's free, and I really like their courses. They're just industry standard. They're not written for any specific language, or, it's just a very good background. And so if you use this link, it'll have a filter set to show all the free courses there that you can take. There's license compliance, there's community best practices. There's a really cool class about building inclusive communities if you have an open source project and want to socialize that and make sure you get a diverse set of contributors on the project. So it's just a really great resource I like to share and encourage people to check out. So that brings us to our next Q&A. So if you have a question that didn't get answered before, or if you have a question on contributions, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Well, we have a lot of questions, Jen. People is excited about this topic. And Ajay is asking, how do you recommend finding a project to work on that is good for beginners and that has a supportive community?
That's a great question. And so actually, if you go to just Google this and go to and search on great open source projects for beginners, there's a GitHub repo where people have curated like friendly projects to get started, and then you can just pick something that you're interested in. So some communities are more engaging than others and are more welcoming to folks that are getting started. And so that's a good way. There's a bunch of GitHub lists where people maintain repos of like, hey, these are really nice projects. They're friendly to beginners. And that's a good way to find them. Also, if you know somebody personally that's working on an open source project, you can check with them to see how that particular community is before you engage with them.
Great, thank you. And Pradia is asking, is there a cookbook to understand how to use licenses or how they affect our product?
Could you repeat that?
Is there a cookbook to understand how to use licenses or how they affect our product?
Yeah, so the recommendation I have there is the Linux Foundation has their best practices, or I think their course is called how to comply with licenses as a developer, or developer 101 for complying with licenses or something like that. That's a good resource. And then there's there's a book that just came out, and it's open source law and policy. I don't remember the title, but ping me on LinkedIn and I can get that for you. But the Linux Foundation course is a good place to start.
Okay, great. And Ola is asking, what are the implications of changing the type of license by the developer sometime after the project exists?
That's a great question, and that can be really, really tricky. So say you have a project, and I've seen this and helped some projects go through this process, and it's not easy. So if it's just your project, and you change the license and you're the only contributor to it, it's fine. You can just change the license. If you have other contributors that have contributed their source code under the original license, you're going to need to coordinate with them and make sure that's okay with them. And so that it can just get really messy if you have a lot of contributors to change the license down the road. But there have been very large projects that have changed their license at some point, so it can be done. So I just recommend that if you're setting up a new project, try to put a lot of thought into what you want that license to be so that you don't have to change it down the road. But if you're the only contributor, you can just change it.
That was a good one. Heather is asking, do you have any suggestions for adding composition analysis to your CI/CD on GitHub? She mentions she's scanned through some of the options and it's a little bit overwhelming.
There are a lot. So GitHub has some capabilities that can do that, some of that for you, that are built in. It just, if there's an option that you can use within GitHub, you know, that's great. If you're scanning your code outside of GitHub, try searching or narrowing the list of the tools based on the language that you're using and the package managers that you're using. And that should help narrow down the list quite a bit. So some of the SCA tools are really good at scanning containers. Some are really good at scanning node packages. Very few are good at scanning C and C++. So it just really depends on the language that you're using. But try searching on that to narrow down kind of the list of tools that would be, you know, candidates.
Okay, and Jen is asking, how are the new artificial intelligence tools going to complicate management of open source tools, composition analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is where I think, so yeah, I'll answer that. So for me, from working in an open source program office and having to, you know, deal more with the compliance side, it is going to be a lot of work and a lot of job security for me and my team. So it's very challenging. And I think the compliance aspect and the tools have not caught up with where the AI tools are already at. So you have different aspects of that. There's the open source projects that are out on GitHub from OpenAI and others, and those are under open source licenses. You can contribute that to them under those licenses, just like anything else. However, using those services is done usually through an API, which has its own terms and conditions different than what's out on GitHub. So you need to be really aware, not just from the open source standpoint, but if you're using an API from one of these tools, what are the terms and conditions attached to using it? Just because it's free doesn't mean you can just do whatever with it. So you need to check, especially if you work at a company, what's your corporate policy around that? And you know, a lot of the tools that require prompts and you're putting in, you know, write a function that can do this, or you're providing prompts and then getting a result back. Your company probably also has rules about that, about sending data outside the company to these different services. So it's not just an open source aspect. There's the usage of the API that comes into play. And then there's also kind of the security concern around what are you typing into these tools. Separately from that, there's a whole nother layer of issues with it, in that there's a lot of lawsuits currently on both the source code side and also when these tools are used to generate art, and I think they're very powerful and very cool. Like I like, you know, trying them out. I think they're amazing. But they're using the training data incorporates copyrighted work. It incorporates unlicensed source code from GitHub and things that, you know, and this is that data aspect we talked about earlier in the presentation. And to me, that's really problematic that, you know, what was scraped to as input to these models. And so, you know, not surprisingly, there are a lot of lawsuits in this space. And so that's a whole nother layer of concern. So all of the AI tools and services, and as exciting as they are, from a compliance standpoint, it is going to be rough. So make sure that if you're, you know, if you want to use those tools, that you reach out, you know, to understand what your policy is internally if you work at a company around use of those tools, and be aware of what everything that you plan on using with them. If it's an API, if you're contributing to the project, you know, if you're creating source code from it. I mean, there's a lot of aspects that go into it, and it's just going to be a really complex and I think pretty exciting topic going forward, which probably deserves its own whole talk.
Definitely. And I guess that we have time for a couple of more questions. Let me pick one. What could be the consequences if the open source you use changes their license? Is there any way to get notified about that change?
Yeah, and this has happened before. That's a great question. And this has happened before and been a big problem before. So if you're using open source under a certain version, the license doesn't change like retroactively for old versions. So say if you've released open source and it was under MIT and you changed it to Apache later or something, those previous versions would still be under the MIT license. It's just once you do your license change going forward, it would be under something else. And really, this is where SCA tools can help you a lot, is they can flag differences in the license between versions. So say if you are pulling in a new major version of a software package that has changed their license, which it has happened on very big projects in open source, it will flag that for you in the Delta scan and say, oh, this is now this other language or this other license. And what you need to be really careful there is sometimes it's not just a license change, but a project will take an otherwise open source license and add a paragraph to it that is not compatible with the open source definition and just kind of sneak it in there. And so these tools sometimes will detect that. Sometimes they won't. And this is where your company's people can help identify that. We keep an eye on things where, you know, something happens with a project, especially one that's widely used. We'll be aware of it and kind of hear people complaining about it. And then we'll update our tooling to detect those types of license changes. So great question. And SCA tooling can help you with that piece too.
Thank you, Jen. And the final question, we're going to end with this one. If you could share a recommendation for project licensing scenario where we are building a product for portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, I like and this is just my personal opinion, but from working at a lot of other companies, this is a commonly, you know, commercial friendly license. The Apache license is super popular. I think, you know, I never really hear complaints about it. And it has a nice patent license in it. And it's just, it's a tried and true solid license. So Apache v2 is my personal favorite if you're trying to get broad adoption on an open source project.
That's great. Thank you for your recommendation. And we are going to answer the rest of the questions via the chat. And thank you so much, Jen, for joining today and giving us this amazing talk. We learned definitely a lot from you today. And from everyone else, thank you so much for joining. Hope that you can find this talk useful for your upcoming projects. And please refer to the recording soon once it is uploaded to our WWCode YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Thank you.